Every state has that one weird story nobody can quite explain. The ghost town, the missing hiker, the building nobody talks about. But New York has something stranger. It has 11 towns where the strangeness isn't hidden or forgotten. It's out in the open, documented, and somehow still flying under the radar. A hamlet where more than a tenth of the residents talk to the dead for a living. A castle sitting alone in a river built to store weapons. An island in New York City that's still technically off limits, a town that legally renamed itself after a ghost story. These aren't legends passed down at campfires. There's footage, drone shots, documentaries, news segments, tourists with cameras. So today we're counting down 11 real towns in New York that genuinely defy logic, starting with the one you've probably driven past without realizing how strange it actually is. Number 11, Cooperstown, New York. Picture a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in about 15 minutes, no rush required. Now picture that same town pulling in visitors by the hundreds of thousands every single year, all because of one building. That's Cooperstown. Roughly 1,800 people actually live here, which is fewer people than you'd find inside a mid-sized concert venue on a Friday night. And yet this place has somehow become sacred ground for an entire sport. The Baseball Hall of Fame sits right in the middle of town, and it turns quiet residential streets into something close to a pilgrimage site every single summer when induction weekend rolls around. Grown men cry here. That's not an exaggeration. It happens every year on camera. Grandfathers bring grandsons here specifically to stand in front of glass cases, holding gloves and bats from players who died decades before either of them was born. Walk down Main Street and you'll see it lined with baseball card shops, memorabilia stores, and diners named after old ball players, all packed into a town that would otherwise look like any other sleepy village tucked into upstate New York's hills. Take away the museum, and this is just a pretty lake town with a few thousand residents and nothing particularly remarkable going on. ESPN shows up every single year without fail. MLB Network sets up cameras right on the lawn outside the building. Travel vloggers treat it like a bucket list stop, the kind of place people plan entire road trips around. The ratio is really what gets you here. A village smaller than most public high schools, somehow carrying the emotional weight of an entire national pastime on its shoulders. Number 10, Bethel, New York. Here's a twist that trips people up literally every single time you bring it up. Ask someone where Woodstock happened, and 9 times out of 10 they'll say, Woodstock, obviously, because why wouldn't it be? Except it didn't happen there. The actual festival, the one with 500,000 people crammed into a farm field, mud everywhere, Hendrix closing it out at sunrise while half the crowd had already left. That happened in Bethel, a town about 60 miles away from the place that ended up getting the naming credit forever. The town of Woodstock, the one everyone assumes hosted it, actually turned the offer down when organizers first came looking for a venue. Bethel said yes, and even that was almost an accident when a local dairy farmer named Max Yadzger offered up his land at the very last minute after other locations fell through. So for more than 50 years now, this quiet corner of Sullivan County has been carrying the legacy of an event named after somewhere else entirely. A permanent case of mistaken identity that never got corrected because the name had already stuck by the time anyone thought to fix it. Today, the actual festival field is preserved, kept open and green, and right next to it sits the Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, a full performance venue and museum built specifically to keep that history alive for people who weren't even born when it happened. Anniversary documentaries return here like clockwork every 5 or 10 years, right on schedule. News crews do the same walk and talk segment every August, standing in that same field, talking about the same mud, the same music, the same one moment that somehow defined a generation, all while happening in a town whose own name never even makes it into the story. Number 9, Chautauqua Institution, Chautauqua, New York. This one feels like discovering a secret door in a house you thought you already knew every inch of. Chautauqua isn't officially a town in the normal sense of the word. It's a gated, privately run community that's been operating continuously since 1874. And once you're actually inside the gates, it genuinely feels like you've stepped into a separate little country with its own rules. There's a gate fee just to enter, which already sets it apart from basically every other town on this list. There's a private police force patrolling the grounds, answering to the institution rather than any outside municipality. There's an entire unwritten code of conduct that residents and visitors are quietly expected to follow, covering everything from how loud you're allowed to be on the porches in the evening to when quiet hours kick in across the whole community. It sits right on the shore of Chautauqua Lake in western New York, and from the outside driving past on the main road, it looks like nothing more than a pretty lakeside village with Victorian houses and shady tree-lined streets. But functionally, on the inside, it runs like its own self-contained little society, complete with its own summer lecture series that's run continuously for well over a century, its own concert programming, and its own religious and educational offerings that draw thousands of people back every single season like clockwork. It has one of the deepest video archives of any place on this entire list, simply because the institution itself has been recording lectures and performances for decades as a matter of routine. On top of that, lifestyle vloggers have picked up on it in more recent years too, drawn in by just how strange it feels that something operating like this exists quietly in plain sight, hiding behind a name most people outside New York have never even heard. Before we keep going, if you're the kind of person who likes finding out the map you grew up with is hiding weirder stuff than it ever let on, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. There's a lot more of this coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss where this list actually ends up. Number 8. Massena, Akwesasne, New York. This is the entry most people scroll straight past without ever realizing what's actually happening on the ground there day to day. Massena sits right up against the Canadian border, and the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation stretches across that exact same line, meaning the international boundary between the United States and Canada physically cuts straight through sovereign indigenous land. Families here live with a border running through the middle of their community every single day of their lives, not as some abstract political fact, but as a lived physical reality. Someone might have a cousin, a grandparent, or even their own backyard technically split between two different countries, two different sets of laws, two different governments claiming jurisdiction over the same small stretch of land. Jurisdiction gets complicated fast in a place like this. Different police forces, different court systems, different customs and immigration rules, all overlapping and occasionally colliding in a way that most Americans never have to think about because they simply don't live anywhere near a line like this one. News crews and border documentary makers have covered pieces of this story over the years, usually circling back to legal disputes or smuggling cases that make the border tangle here impossible to ignore or simplify. What makes this place genuinely strange isn't some spooky legend passed down at a campfire or a museum exhibit behind glass. It's that the everyday, unremarkable reality here quietly breaks the assumption most of us carry around without even noticing it, that a country's border is a simple, solid, unbroken line you could trace with your finger on a map. Here, that line doesn't just run near people's lives, it runs straight through them. Number 7. Bannerman Island, Polypal Island, New York. If you've ever scrolled through drone footage online and seen a crumbling castle sitting completely alone in the middle of a river, there's a decent chance what you were looking at was this exact place. Bannerman Island sits in the Hudson River, and the ruin standing on it looks like it was plucked straight out of the Scottish Highlands and dropped into New York State by mistake, stone towers and all. It wasn't built as a home in the traditional sense. And it definitely wasn't built by royalty or nobility trying to make a statement. A businessman named Francis Bannerman built it as a private warehouse, meant to store surplus military weapons and ammunition that he bought up in bulk after wars ended, and he designed the whole thing to look like a castle purely because he wanted it to, for no reason beyond his own taste. Decades of harsh river weather, a massive explosion back in 1920 that blew apart a chunk of the structure, and years of general neglect have left it in ruins today, roofless in places, walls slowly crumbling down into the water below. And that's exactly why it draws so much footage year after year. Drone pilots love it because it hands them a dramatic cinematic shot with almost zero effort involved. River, ruins, castle silhouette against the sky, done, no complicated setup required. Boat tours run past it on a regular schedule throughout the warmer months. It photographs like something pulled straight out of a fantasy movie set, except it's a real structure with a genuinely strange, very real origin story, sitting quietly in a river that most people driving along the nearby highway probably never even glance twice at. Number 6. North Brother Island, New York City, New York. This one carries a heavier, more unsettling kind of eeriness because it's still forbidden ground, right now, today, not just in some historical sense. North Brother Island sits in the East River, technically part of New York City in every legal way, and yet almost nobody has legally set foot on it in decades. It's where Mary Mallon, far better known to history as Typhoid Mary, was quarantined against her will for years after being identified as an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever, someone who could spread the disease without ever showing symptoms herself. She lived out a significant portion of her life isolated on this small island while the rest of the city carried on completely normally, just a short boat ride away, close enough to see but impossibly far in every way that mattered. After her death, the island kept getting repurposed by the city over the following decades. First as a hospital, treating returning war veterans, later as a facility for treating addiction, before eventually being abandoned entirely and left to be slowly reclaimed by nature. Buildings now sit swallowed by thick vines, with collapsing floors and caved-in roofs, and legal access is still tightly restricted today, mostly because of how genuinely dangerous the structures have become to walk through. That restriction, ironically, is exactly what keeps drawing urban explorers and drone operators back to it again and again. Getting legal access requires special permission that's rarely granted, but plenty of footage still exists from boats slowly circling the shoreline, and from the rare film crews who manage to secure authorized visits capturing a place that's simultaneously part of the busiest, most crowded city in America and completely eerily cut off from it. Number 5, Roosevelt Island, New York City, New York, right in the middle of the East River, close enough that you can see the entire Manhattan skyline glittering from its shoreline, sits a sliver of land that somehow feels like it belongs to a completely different city altogether. Roosevelt Island has modern apartment buildings and a tramway that carries ordinary commuters back and forth to Manhattan every single day like clockwork, but tucked away into its southern end are the ruins of an old smallpox hospital, walls crumbling and windows empty and staring, deliberately left standing as a kind of preserved intentional ruin rather than being torn down like most old buildings eventually are. There's also the crumbling remains of a former asylum on the island, adding yet another layer of unsettling history to a place most New Yorkers walk or ride past without giving it a second thought on their way to work. The contrast is really what makes this whole place work as a piece of content. Modern glass and steel residential towers standing on one side, decaying 19th century medical ruins sitting on the other, all connected by a tram ride across the river that itself feels like something lifted straight out of a movie. Urban exploration channels have practically built entire content categories around this one island alone. Bright Sun Films, Colo Perry, and dozens of smaller independent creators have all made videos here over the years because it delivers everything a creator could want all at once. Easy legal access, a genuinely wild visual contrast, real documented medical history, and a commute-worthy tram ride that makes for a great, dramatic opening shot every single time someone films it. Number 4, Seneca Falls, New York. Some towns get famous for exactly one thing, and that's the whole story. Seneca Falls somehow ended up famous for two completely different things that have nothing to do with each other, and both of them are genuinely enormous in their own right. First, this is where the actual women's rights movement in America formally began. The Seneca Falls Convention held here in 1848 is the event that historians consistently point to as the official starting point of organized women's suffrage in the United States, the moment the whole movement got its first real public platform. That alone would be more than enough to put a small town on the map permanently, guaranteeing it a place in history textbooks for generations. But then there's the second thing sitting right alongside it. For decades now, people have claimed this exact town was the visual inspiration for Bedford Falls, the fictional hometown at the emotional center of It's a Wonderful Life. The old bridge in town looks strikingly similar to the one in the film. The Main Street layout echoes the movie's version closely enough that visitors notice immediately. Even director Frank Capra's own personal connections to the area get cited repeatedly as supporting evidence, even though he himself never actually confirmed the connection outright before he died. So now you've got one town that's simultaneously the real, documented birthplace of a movement that changed the entire country, and also the possible unconfirmed birthplace of one of the most beloved fictional towns in American film history. Local museums here lean into both stories hard, giving each one equal weight. And film history, explainers keep circling back to it online because the coincidence is honestly just too good and too strange to ever fully leave alone. If you're enjoying figuring out which of these places you'd actually want to visit yourself, go ahead and drop a comment and let us know. Seriously, scroll down and tell us your pick so far. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I do read every single one that comes in. Number 3, Chittenango, New York. There's something almost funny about the fact that a completely random, ordinary-looking town in upstate New York decided to fully commit to a fantasy land that doesn't even exist, and somehow it actually worked out for them. Chittenango is the birthplace of L. Frank Baum, the man who wrote The Wizard of Oz, and instead of just putting up a small plaque somewhere downtown and calling it a day like most towns would, this one leaned all the way in, no half measures at all. Walk down the sidewalks here and you'll notice something odd underfoot almost immediately. Actual yellow bricks embedded right into the pavement, tracing a path through the middle of town, like a real, walkable version of the yellow brick road from the story. Every single summer, they throw a full festival called Ozstravaganza, complete with parades, costumed characters walking the streets, and crowds that show up specifically because of a children's book written well over a century ago at this point. It's a strange, almost endearing kind of civic pride, taking one author's birthplace and turning it into a permanent, physically walkable tribute to an entire fictional world he simply happened to dream up one day. That combination, a genuinely small, ordinary-looking town paired with a giant, colorful, instantly recognizable visual hook built directly into its sidewalks, is basically a gift handed to anyone who shows up with a camera. Festival footage rolls in every single year without fail, right on schedule, and the yellow bricks alone make for one of the easiest, most instantly recognizable shots on this entire list. No explanation even needed once people see it. Number 2, Lilydale, New York. Now we're getting into the kind of numbers that genuinely don't make sense, no matter how many times you say them out loud. Lilydale has a total population of roughly 275 people, a number small enough to fit inside a single school gymnasium with room to spare. Out of those 275 residents, around 40 of them are registered, actively working mediums, meaning their real job, their actual source of income, is communicating with the dead on behalf of paying visitors. Sit with that ratio for a second, because it really is unusual. That's not a town with a handful of psychics scattered around for novelty. That's a town where an enormous chunk of the entire working population has built their whole profession around spiritual communication. And it's been operating that way continuously since the community was first founded back in the 1800s as a dedicated center for the spiritualist movement. Every single year, more than 20,000 visitors travel here specifically to sit down across from a medium and try to reach someone they've lost, someone they miss, someone they never got to say goodbye to properly. HBO thought this whole story was compelling enough to build an entire full-length documentary around it called No One Dies in Lily Dale, directed by Stephen Canner, following real visitors through real sessions with real emotional stakes on camera. Smithsonian has covered the town too in its own segments, and there's a steady, ongoing stream of standalone YouTube walkthroughs from independent creators who simply want to capture what it actually feels like to walk through a town where talking to spirits is treated as completely normal, everyday work, no different from running a bakery or a hardware store. Number 1, Sleepy Hollow, New York. And here's the one that ties this whole list together because it's the clearest, most complete example of a town that looked at a piece of fiction and decided to become it on purpose, fully and permanently. Sleepy Hollow used to be called North Tarrytown, a perfectly ordinary name for a perfectly ordinary town. Then, in the mid-1990s, the town actually held a vote and legally changed its own name to Sleepy Hollow, deliberately tying its entire public identity to Washington Irving's famous ghost story about a headless horseman chasing a terrified schoolteacher through the dark woods at night. That's not a nickname picked up casually over time, and it's not just a clever marketing campaign either. That's a full legal rebrand, an entire town collectively deciding its future economy would run on a story that wasn't even historically set in that exact real location to begin with. And it worked spectacularly, beyond what anyone could have predicted at the time. October here isn't just busy, it's completely transformative for the whole town. The population effectively multiplies as visitors pour in for Horseman's Hollow, a full-scale haunted event built entirely around the legend, along with cemetery tours, lantern-lit walks through the old graveyard, and constant coverage of the actual bridge tied to the original story. Drone footage of the cemetery at dusk shows up online every fall like clockwork. News segments run every single Halloween season without fail, year after year. Full event coverage from the Horseman's Hollow, production itself gets filmed and shared constantly. A town took a scary story that wasn't even historically tied to its exact location and turned it into a permanent, reliable economic engine. And it's been paying off steadily for decades now, with no signs of slowing down. If there's one single place on this entire list that proves just how far a town can go, when it fully commits to its own legend, without hesitation or half measures, it's this one. So there you have it, 11 towns that all share the exact same strange thread running underneath them, places where the everyday reality on the ground somehow ended up stranger than fiction itself, and where enough people showed up with cameras over the years to actually prove it wasn't just talk. If you made it all the way here, you clearly like this kind of deep, weird corner of the map most people never bother looking into. So go ahead and hit like on this video right now before you forget. And if you want more lists like this one, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one when it drops. And honestly, tell us in the comments below, out of all 11 towns on this list, which one would you actually get in your car and drive to right now, today, no hesitation?